I must say that writing the Rommel biography was one of the most rewarding books that I've ever written, not financially, but it was a rewarding book because it's always nice to write a book about a hero. And he was a hero, as Winston Churchill himself said in 1942, at a time when things stood very darkly for us. We had lost Singapore, we were losing the whole of our empire in the East, but Winston Churchill stood up in the House of Commons and said, there comes a time when you have to say across the dust and smoke of battle, across the lines that separate us, that you are confronted with a very great soldier indeed. Where does the legend of Rommel, the hero of the 20th of July, the hero of the resistance, come from? Why are there so many streets in Germany named after Rommel? One of the only generals, I think, if not the only general in Rommel, after whom a street is named in Germany. So sometimes, you know, ladies and gentlemen, students come up to me after my speeches in Germany, youngsters, and they say, Mr. Irving, I've got a problem. I hear you speak, and I hear my parents speak, and I hear my teachers speak, and it's all different things, and I don't know who to believe, who were the real heroes and who were the traitors. And I would say to this guy, buy a map of your hometown and have a look at the index. And if this general you're worried about, or this politician, if there's a street or town square named after him, you can guarantee he was an enemy of the German people, he was a traitor and a conspirator, and he did everything he could to harm the German cause. On the other hand, if there's no street named after him, then probably he was a hero who went down fighting and did everything he could as a patriot for his fatherland. And it's a pretty good guide. In other words, this guide is using your local map to decide who the nice guys were, the good guys, the patriots. It works every time in Germany. Of course, they're going to have to change all the maps now in Germany. After a few years, they're going to have to wipe out an awful lot of streets. But in Germany, in the case of Rommel, we're confronted with a problem because there's a large number of towns and squares, which certainly used to be named after Rommel until my book's published anyway. In fact, in Stuttgart, there's even a town named after Rommel's, there's even an alley named after Rommel's adjutant called Rommel Adjutantengasse. Because this is the alley in which that particular adjutant, a man called Helmut Lang, was born and still lived. He still lives there now, for all I know. So why do we find that there's a legend about Erwin Rommel? Well, the answer is it suited these swine, these little Miniaturwürmchen, as Adolf Hitler called them, these pathetic creeps, these schmucks, these gentlemen of the 20th of July. It suited their purpose to try and make out that they weren't all schmucks, that right out in front of them they were commanded in spirit, if not in body, by one of Germany's most outstanding military characters, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel himself. He was no longer in a position to defend himself. But in fact, the lying about him started only a few weeks before his death. And the exploitation of his name started in the summer of 1944. So what was Rommel's career? World War I, he was an infantry commander. He was a lieutenant in the German infantry, finding himself fighting the Italians. He loathed the Italians. He was fighting the Italians in the Alps around Venezia Giulia. He fought very well. Much to his rage, he found that he wasn't distinguished at a time when he thought he should be distinguished with Germany's highest World War I decoration, the famous Blue Max. The Pour le Mérite, which is the blue enamel medal, the cross that they have on a ribbon around their neck. Lieutenant Schörner, the later Field Marshal Schörner, he got the medal, and Rommel thought he should have got it, and Rommel did the unthinkable. I mean, you know how army officers are. Rommel appealed. He wrote letters to every succeeding higher command and headquarters and general demanding an identical medal for himself. And eventually he got it. He got the Pour le Mérite in this rather unorthodox way, and he was very proud thereby to join the ranks of the great World War I legendary heroes like Manfred von Richthofen and, of course, Hermann Göring. There were these legendary German commanders, at that time only officers, lieutenants or army captains or aviators who went around with the Blue Max, the Pour le Mérite. And it put him a class above a lot of his contemporaries in the interwar years, because Rommel, unlike a lot of his contemporaries, had never gone through the German General Staff. Very important to know this because it has a bearing on his last days. Rommel was not a German General Staff officer, although he rose to the highest rank in Germany, short of Reichsmarschall, Field Marshal. He had never gone through the German General Staff. He had no book learning. He had none of the knowledge of the logistics, the build-up, the sense of time and space that a General Staff officer acquires when he learns how to conduct successful battles. Rommel won his battles by other means. He did the unexpected. We're going to see about that in a minute. But this earned for him a lot of envy and a lot of distaste among the... It's rather like those who have been to West Point and those who haven't been to West Point in this country. The word rivalry isn't strong enough. There's an element of envy and distaste and mutual distrust between the insiders and the outsiders. And Rommel remained all his life, until the bitter end, an outsider. The more successful he was in World War I, the more successful he was between the wars, because he was one of the exalted few who stayed in the German professional army wall to wall from the time he went into the army as a cadet until the time he committed suicide in October 1944. He was a German army officer. And the success that he engendered during that period, his military triumphs and victories, aroused a great deal of envy from the German generals and officers who had been in the German General Staff. He had not paid any attention to politics in the interwar years. He was part of the 100,000-man German army, and in the aftermath of the Nazis' seizure of power in 1933, he remained in the German army with a very lowly rank. In 1935, he was still only a colonel. He was in Goslar, commanding the local Jäger battalion, a kind of infantry battalion, when Adolf Hitler paid his first visit to Goslar in connection with a local Nazi party rally. And the photograph shows this surprisingly small Field Marshal Rommel, at that time still only an army captain or colonel, escorting his Führer with a drawn sword in the grounds of the Goslar castle, and Adolf Hitler walking at his side, much taller than this rather short and stubby and unprepossessing figure standing next to him. Something about Rommel must have attracted Hitler's attention, because in 1936 he sent for him and put him in charge of security arrangements at the Nuremberg Party rally, which Rommel did very well. When the usual gaggle of Gauleiters tried to follow Hitler in their motor cars when he drove off, Hitler said to Rommel, Herr Oberst, please make sure that nobody follows me. I want a bit of privacy. And Rommel obtained that privacy for his Führer by planting an armoured car across the road until the Führer's car had driven out of sight. A couple of years later, when Hitler marches into Austria and then into the Sudeten territories and finally into Prague, Rommel is right at Hitler's side. He is appointed as commandant of the Führer's headquarters. Führer's headquarters at that time is a kind of mobile concept. Everywhere Hitler went, the headquarters staff went with him, and somebody had to be in charge of the routine arrangements of running Hitler's headquarters. And this was Rommel. And he used his influence in that respect very cleverly. He writes his letters back to Lucy saying, today I had lunch with the Führer again, and I had some very interesting discussions with him about tactics. Because he's the officer in charge of Hitler's railway train, which enters Prague or enters Czechoslovakia or enters Austria, he gets a proximity to Hitler, which the general staff officers don't get. And Hitler rather likes him. Hitler's an Austrian, Rommel is a Swabian. Somehow they get on well with each other, and they talk a lot. And when, after the invasion of Poland, Rommel accompanies Hitler to Prague, to Poland, to Warsaw, sees the devastation, comes back, writes to Lucy about what he has seen there and about his enormous admiration for the Führer, who has managed to defeat a country the size of Poland in only 18 days. Rommel says to Hitler, mein Führer, the next time round I want to be in charge of a division. I don't want to be in charge of our headquarters anymore. I want to do something. So he said he wanted a division, and Hitler said, yes, well, I think we can see to that. What kind of division do you have in mind? And Rommel, who was never a modest man, said, mein Führer, how about an armoured division? A panzer division would suit me nicely. Now, panzer divisions, of course, were the crème de la crème. Everybody wanted, is like joining the 82nd Airborne or the 101st here. It's as though one of you had said to President Bush, well, I mean, you might get away with it if you had the right connections, who knows? If you said you wanted to take over a division, and Bush says, what division do you want? And you said, how about the 82nd Airborne? And Bush said, fine, I'll fix it up for you. That's what Hitler did for Rommel. So by January 1940, those two men were like that, Hitler and Rommel. A great deal of mutual respect and admiration, and Hitler was right, because Hitler had somehow identified in Rommel a typical trusting armoured commander who would succeed where the slow, hesitant, prevaricating general staff officers would hesitate and fumble and fail. So Rommel got the 7th Armoured Division, and he spent the next 2 or 3 months training it up for the campaign against France. He developed new tactics. He devised new methods of using armour en masse. He read the works of men like Littleheart and General J.F.C. Fuller and, of course, General Charles de Gaulle. He read everything there was to read about armoured warfare tactics, and because he'd never been in a tank in his life before, but he climbed into a tank and found to his delight that it could go uphill as well as downhill, could do all sorts of things, and he felt invulnerable. In fact, Rommel was the ideal commander because, in a way, he was invulnerable. He had that kind of rare, almost magical spirit. He could stand on top of a railway embankment in full view of the enemy artillery, in full view of the enemy infantry, with machine gun fire thudding into the embankment all around him and bombs crashing down 1 or 2 yards away and killing his adjutant and people like that in the French campaign, and he wasn't touched. Rather like Hitler himself. The two men had this kind of magical quality that protected them in some way from the forces of evil, from the forces of the enemy, and that in turn engendered an enormous loyalty among their followers. The men who served under Rommel swore by him. And so it was in the French campaign when Rommel was right through to the Channel coast and right on down to Cherbourg. And when the choice came in the winter of 1940-1941 who to send to North Africa to help bail out Mussolini from his predicament there, Hitler, as he later said, found himself confronted with 2 or 3 names. Manstein, who had greatly impressed him in the French campaign, Schörner, or Rommel, or Dietl, who had impressed him in the Narvik campaign in Norway. And Hitler said, you need somebody who's got his men behind him, because in North Africa, as I fancy the American troops are going to find out in Saudi Arabia, you've got the local climate and conditions against you. And unless you've got men who are prepared to go through thick and thin with you, then you're not going to get anywhere. Dietl is one case. That might work. He had appalling Arctic conditions in Narvik to contend with. And Rommel, I think, he says, will also follow. Eventually the job fell to Rommel. Didn't go to Manstein because Manstein, Hitler felt, didn't have that kind of backing from his men. He was a general staff officer. So Rommel got the job of taking a light infantry division down to North Africa in January, February 1941. And these troops snuck into North Africa behind the Italian position in Tripoli, just as the British advance right across the North African Mediterranean coastline was about to be on the point of entering Tripoli. If the British forces had entered Tripoli and thrown Italy out of their Libyan colony, it would have produced very severe repercussions for the Italians, the allies of the Germans at that time. But at this fateful moment, Winston Churchill, who had no idea, of course, that Rommel had gone down to North Africa with his division, Winston Churchill wavered. And he pulled a lot of vital forces out of the British forces in North Africa and sent them to a hopeless campaign in Greece instead. And so the British offensive faltered just before Tripoli and gave time for Rommel to get in there. Now, Rommel's instructions from the Italian High Command and from Berlin were, thou shalt not on any circumstance launch an offensive against the British, thou shalt build up a purely defensive line at such and such a point, and thou shalt not proceed further to the east of this line. And about that time we British began reading that particular code. We realized to our horror that not only were the Germans there, but that General Rommel was in command, which we'd already come up against him in Dunkirk. But we were reading the signals and the orders that were going to Rommel, and we knew that Rommel was under orders on no account to launch an offensive, and we believed that a German general would obey orders. So we were quite happily sitting back with our arms folded when he attacked. He totally disobeyed orders. He cut right across the Sinaian Peninsula, cut off enormous numbers of British troops, 30 or 40,000 British troops, captured 3 British generals on the 2nd or 3rd day. And this was one of his most glorious and gallant exploits. Within a few weeks he had come almost as far as the Egyptian frontier. He had restored the Italian sense of pride. He had made it plain to Adolf Hitler that with a little bit more effort you could in fact capture the whole of Egypt, advance across the Suez Canal, come up through the Middle East and join hands with his own offensive, which he was at that time planning against Russia. He could join forces somewhere in the Middle East with forces coming down through the Caucasus. Rommel opened up for Adolf Hitler new vistas. He became Adolf Hitler's favorite general. From that point on, mid-1941, Rommel's face was on the front cover of every German illustrated magazine and on the front cover of quite a few Allied newspapers and magazines as well. There's a reason for this. to explain our setbacks, our failures and our reverses in the Middle East and in North Africa, we had to try and make out that we were up against a superhuman force who couldn't be stopped, namely General Rommel. So we had to build up our own enemy at that time to explain our own reverses. And later on, of course, when the tables were turned and they come to Al Alamein, then you want to build up your enemy again to make out the fact that this wasn't just anybody we defeated, this was the unstoppable General Rommel that we had defeated. So you had two reasons, both of which militated in Rommel's favour. We ourselves, our propaganda, built him up to an unstoppable, brilliant, tactically sound German general, more than a match for any American, more than a match for any British general, but we will defeat him somehow. And this was the kind of story that went through the British newspapers from 1941 through to 1943. And Adolf Hitler realized, too, that the name of Rommel was worth a lot, because when Rommel fell ill, and when it was quite plain that the German forces who had retired into North Africa in 1943, into Tunisia, were going to be defeated, Hitler arranged for Rommel to be evacuated in time back to the continental mainland. But nobody was told. People were left in the belief that Rommel was still there in the pocket fighting on. His name fought on, even though the general himself had been evacuated to safety. We see in that period, November 1942, the first crisis of confidence between Hitler and Rommel. This is to be admitted. I'm not saying that the two of them were thick and fast friends right from the first moment to the end. Rommel went through a serious nervous breakdown, shall we say, in November 1942 after the offensive began at El Alamein. He couldn't understand why he wasn't getting the oil and the supplies and the ammunition he needed to defeat Montgomery. He didn't realize that he was his own undoing, because he was constantly radioing back to Berlin saying, when are we going to get more oil and ammunition and supplies? The morale of my troops is at breaking point. If the British keep on the fight like this after El Alamein, then we can only hold out another 2 or 3 days. And Berlin would radio back to him saying, we've made inquiries of the Italian authorities, and the supertanker Proserpina is leaving Naples harbour on the 3rd of November and is going to arrive at Tobruk on the 6th. And of course we were reading the messages. We British were reading all these code signals. So we'd have submarines waiting outside the harbours, and every single ship that was sent out to Rommel with oil and with ammunition was being sunk. And he got more and more desperate. And we know that in the Battle of El Alamein, which began on October the 23rd, 1942, Rommel was in such a desperate position that he said he couldn't hold out for more than a few days. But Montgomery was in an even more desperate position. The British commander, Field Marshal Montgomery, sent a telegram to Winston Churchill on October the 25th saying, I think we're going to have to pull back. My offensive has failed. And at that moment he was told by the British code breakers on a secure line, hold on, because we know from Rommel that he can only hold out for 2 days himself. He's collapsing under your weight. So Rommel was his own undoing. Because of his own garrulousness, his own talkativeness on what he thought were the secure coded transmissions, he was his own undoing. His oil ships were sunk. He ended up being hounded across North Africa, an amazing military feat, this is true. He had Montgomery's entire Eighth Army after him, and yet he managed to rescue 200,000 or 300,000 German and Italian troops and bring them all the way across the North African coastline into Tunisia and form a new bridgehead there with the loss of only very few men and hardly any of his equipment. An incredible feat of generalship, which shows what a rotten general, really, General Montgomery was on the British side. Montgomery repeatedly tried to outflank Rommel and take him from behind, and arrived only to find that the bird had already flown. Rommel arrived back in Tunisia, he was airlifted, the battle in North Africa went to an end. And he regarded himself, we know that from his diaries and from his letters, as a failure. For 6 months, he slouched around Berlin in plain clothes, wearing a trilby hat, unrecognized by the Berlin population because he's not in his famous uniform, and he hankered after a new job. In October 1943, the Commander-in-Chief West, in other words, the German Commander-in-Chief based in Paris, sent a report to Adolf Hitler on the weakness of the defences in France against an Allied landing. And this was the first thing that made Adolf Hitler sit up. He realized that something now had to be done, because with the continuation of the war and the failure to secure a rapid victory over Russia, he is going to have to count on the full weight, meeting the full weight of the British and the French and the German and the American troops in the West. There's going to be a landing somewhere. It's going to be in France. Hitler's convinced of that. and it is now time for him to build up the Atlantic Wall and put a really tough tactical commander in charge. On November the 5th, 1943, he sent for Field Marshal Erwin Rommel and said to Rommel, I'm going to put you in tactical command of the entire Battle of France when it comes. You will be under Field Marshal von Rundstedt, who is Commander-in-Chief, but the moment the battle begins, the moment the British and the Americans set foot on the coast of France, you will take charge of the battle. Thus he effectively told Rommel, I am giving you a last chance of glory. You've lost Libya, you've lost North Africa for the Italians, we've got the worst possible problems in Italy, the Italians have defected, they've come out on the Allied side against us, and effectively we have you to thank for that, Field Marshal Rommel. If we were still fighting in North Africa, the Italians wouldn't have defected. That's effectively what he said to him. However, I am such a friend of yours, I'm going to give you this chance of one last chance of glory. And from November 1943 onwards, we see in Rommel's private letters how he is convinced that he is going to pull it off, that he is single-handedly going to fight that invasion battle in France, and he's going to win victory for Hitler. He writes to Lucy, I am convinced of victory. Every morning I get up and I look in the mirror and I think to myself, there's no way we can fail. Every week that passes and we strengthen our invasion defenses. He was driving great, gigantic, pointed stakes into the beaches all the way along the French coast. The stakes themselves were spiked with mines. Immense minefields, millions of mines were sown in the broad belt immediately along the coastline, all the way along France. The whole of a coastal belt was evacuated from people. Towns were leveled to the ground to provide a field of fire for the guns. New guns were in place. Huge areas were prepared for flooding the moment the Allies set foot on the French coastline. Rommel did what, in fact, the German General Staff should have done for 3 years, but of course they hadn't. For 3 years they'd been in France, and for 3 years they sat on their fat asses and they'd done nothing at all. But now Rommel came, and he put a new spirit into the defenders there, and he made it plain that not only could they, but they would defend France and prevent the Anglo-Americans from landing. And Hitler said to him, you can be sure of one thing, Field Marshal. If we throw the British and the Americans off the beaches, then within 2 or 3 weeks I will have pulled out our half dozen or our dozen German panzer divisions from the battlefield area, and I will have sent them straight back by train to the Eastern Front, and we will mop up the Russians, and then the war will be over. So Germany's final victory relies on you, Field Marshal Rommel. Now it's important to realize this. Put yourself in Rommel's shoes. You've lost the battle in North Africa. You've lost an entire continent. The Italian allies point the finger at you, Field Marshal Rommel, as being responsible for this defeat. You are not going to go down in the history books as Germany's greatest strategic commander unless you can pull a victory out of the hat. And your beloved Führer has given you this chance, and that is going to be the Battle of Normandy. You are not, under these circumstances, going to throw in your hand, you're not going to make common cause with the traitors who are plotting against Adolf Hitler at this time. Because if you do, you will not restore your reputation as a great military commander. This is one reason why I say all the indications are that Rommel was not a traitor. At this time, the spring and the summer of 1944, he was doing everything he could to prepare France for the victory and to fight that battle through to the victory when the invasion came. Then something happened in April 1944 which was to change his life and, in fact, hurry on his death. A new chief of staff was assigned to him. His wife, Lucy Rommel, who was by this time a bit of a virago, a bit of an Amazon, a bit of a masculine woman. In the early years, she was a lovely thing to look at by the photographs. But by 1944, she had him under his thumb. And she said that she had picked a fight, unfortunately, with the wife of his chief of staff, General Alfred Gauser. So Gauser would have to go. So Rommel had to get rid of Alfred Gauser, who had been his chief of staff throughout the entire North African campaign, and replace him with another chief of staff. And the chief of staff who came to replace him at the beginning of April 1944 was an educated, piano-playing, gifted general staff officer by the name of General Hans Speidel. And the villain of the Rommel piece from now on is Hans Speidel, S-P-E-I-D-E-L, Hans Speidel, who later rose to become, bless his heart, Supreme Commander of NATO land forces in Europe. So with a certain relish, I reveal what I found out about him and his role in Rommel's death when the book was published. He arrived to take command of the staff of Rommel Rommel's chief of staff, on about April the 1st, 1944, having come straight from Hitler's headquarters where Hitler had given him the Ritterkreuz, the Knight's Cross, for his work as the chief of staff of an army group on the Eastern Front. Speidel, as I said, was an intellectually gifted man, a very clever man, but he was also up to his neck in the anti-Hitler plot. He was plotting Hitler's overthrow, and Rommel didn't know it. In fact, if you look closely at the army side of the Hitler plot, you find how much it was very much a plot of chiefs of staff. People like Stauffenberg, who was the chief of staff of Fromm, and so on. It was all the chiefs of staff who were plotting without really Fromm and people without their superiors knowing what was going on. It was the chiefs of staff who were the clever guys who were doing the dirty work, and then when things went bad, they pulled back and said, it wasn't me, it was him. And that's exactly what we'll find is going to happen with Field Marshal Rommel. Round about June 1944, the Paris plotters, who were headed by the chief of staff of the military governor in France, General von Stumpnagel, decided it was time to try and win over other big names. And they sent the chief of staff of Stumpnagel, a man called von Hofacker, to go and have a chat with Rommel. Now, Rommel was a pretty intimidating character. He was up to his eyeballs day after day, we know that from his diary, with journeys out to the front. He was preparing France for the invasion battle that was about to come any day. Now, Rommel was a pretty intimidating character. He was up to his eyeballs day after day, we know that from his diary, with journeys out to the front. He was preparing France for the invasion battle that was about to come any day. He was worried about where the invasion was going to come. On the one hand, he had Adolf Hitler, who had said to him and all the Western commanders, the Western generals and field marshals who had assembled on the Obersalzberg in Germany on March the 20th, 1944, Hitler had said to them, I tell you the invasion is going to come in two places, either in Normandy, in France, or very close by in Brittany. In fact, Hitler himself said he was almost certain the Allies were going to invade Normandy, and of course he was quite right. Whereas the General Staff said, Mein Führer, it's not going to come in Normandy at all, it's going to come in the Pas de Calais. That's the shortest route. Have a look at the map, Mein Führer, it's only 20 miles. In other words, the German General Staff said effectively that the Allied armies, the British and Americans, are going to cross the Channel using the British rail ferry, effectively. They were going to come the shortest possible route and head straight for the Ruhr. And Hitler said, no, they won't do that. They'll make the indirect route. They'll seize the Cherbourg Peninsula first and use that as a base for landing us. He was absolutely right. And I've got it in verbatim in the speech he made on March the 20th, 1944. And all the telegrams he sent subsequently to the commanders in Normandy saying, you've got to prepare Normandy. I'm insisting on additional reinforcements for Normandy because that is where the invasion is going to come. But Rommel had been told by the General Staff it's not going to come there at all, Field Marshal. It's going to come in the Pas de Calais, which is up by Dover. So he was torn between reinforcing the 7th Army in Normandy, as the Führer had ordered, and reinforcing the 15th Army in the Pas de Calais, where the General Staff, Speidel, and the German High Command were instructing. So Rommel really didn't have time to talk politics when Colonel Hofacker came to see him on about June the 1st or 2nd, 1944. In fact, after Hofacker had gone back to Paris, he turned to his staff and said, strange chap, what was he after? Couldn't make head or tail of him. And that's the way an English officer said, but that's exactly what Rommel said to his staff. Couldn't make head or tail of him. What was he after? Because Hofacker was very worried. I mean, he's only a lieutenant colonel in the German Air Force, and here he is trying to win over the Field Marshal Rommel, one of the top Nazis, one of Hitler's most important characters, one of his most important generals. He's trying to win him over for a plot against Hitler. So, in fact, Hofacker didn't say anything at all. Hofacker just talked in general terms. But human nature being what it is, when Hofacker went back to Paris, he said to Stumpnagel, the military governor, who was in the plot, I've won him. He's fire and flammer. He's fire and flame on our side. I've won Rommel right over. Couldn't hold him back. We know all this because I know what Stumpnagel later on said. But you can see how fate is beginning to wind up dark clouds over the future career of Field Marshal Erwin Rommel. Speidel and his gang, he was having a little convivial party that evening of all the anti-Hitler plotters, because the old man, Rommel, had gone back home to Germany a couple of days earlier on leave, assured by Berlin that the invasion wasn't imminent. Rommel had gone back to Germany, Speidel was in charge, and he'd invited all the plotters around for an evening's drinking. And they had a lot of wine and a lot of cognac that evening. I know that because I have the private diary of Admiral Ruger, who was the naval officer on Rommel's staff, and he describes in his shorthand secret diary how they all got blind drunk that evening at Speidel's headquarters on Speidel's staff, and they went to bed at 1:15 a.m., although the first messages had arrived already from Normandy of massive parachute landings. Speidel said, unimportant, and they all went to bed. Around about 6 a.m., it's beginning to get nervous because they're getting more warnings of parachute landings over the whole of the Normandy area, dummy parachute landings elsewhere, and as the dawn is beginning to rise, they can see a huge invasion fleet on the horizon. Speidel is unconcerned. In the war diary of Speidel's staff, Army Group B, for 3.5 hours, suddenly there are no entries at all. They'd all gone to bed for 3.5 hours between 6 a.m. and 9:15 a.m. that morning, as though nothing at all had happened. What had happened? Well, what had happened was 100 tanks had already landed by the time they got up, 100,000 men had hit the beaches, and the 7th Army was under colossal onslaught from the initial waves of the Anglo-American invasion. By that time, the invasion was virtually impossible to ward off. Rommel got the news at 9 a.m. that morning at his home near Stuttgart. He had to drive 790 kilometers back to his headquarters. By the time he got there at 10 p.m. that night, the battle is already lost. On the 17th of July, 1944, Rommel is driving in his motor car behind the front lines, being driven there in this large open Hoch motor car, a 6-seater, rather like a grand touring sports car, when a British Spitfire has come down out of the clouds and has machine-gunned the road and has killed his driver. And the car has crashed off the road into the ditch, headed into a tree, and Rommel is smashed unconscious. He has a quadruple skull fracture. When he comes to a day later, he's in a French hospital being looked after by a French medical team. They fear for his life. They evacuate him back to a rear hospital a couple of days later. And on July the 21st, he hears for the first time that on the day before, an attempt has been made on Hitler's life. A German staff officer has left a bomb under Hitler's conference table in East Prussia, has promptly quit the room. 4 of Hitler's staff have been killed outright in the blast. Hitler himself, by a miracle, has emerged, a few splinters in his arm and a bit bruised and dented, but otherwise unscathed. A witch hunt begins to find out who are the perpetrators of this appalling stab in the back. Now, we can say with great certainty that up to the moment of his injury, Rommel's fanatical loyalty to Adolf Hitler was unchanged, because in his private conversations, which Admiral Ruger wrote down in shorthand in his diary, which I had when I wrote my book on Rommel, Trail of the Fox, in his private conversations, Rommel continues right up to the middle of July to express the utmost fanatical loyalty to Adolf Hitler, even in his private circle of friends. When Admiral Ruger says to him on one occasion, wouldn't it be the right thing now to try and kind of make some deal with Montgomery before the big breakthrough comes? And to do a deal with Montgomery whereby we just open up the Western Front and then advance side by side, shoulder by shoulder with the British and the Americans on Berlin and throw the Russians back. Rommel says, well, I'm convinced that this is going to be the ultimate solution. But I am also certain of one thing. The Führer is such a genius, such a strategic and military genius, that he will take precisely the right decision when the time comes. Now, a man who says that on July the 14th, 1944, is not going to be the man who knows anything at all about a bomb being put under that genius's table just 6 days later. But these quotations, you don't find them in other people's biographies on Rommel because they haven't done the work. They haven't found these diaries. When Rommel is told about the attempt on Hitler's life, suddenly the scales fall from his eyes, and he said, the crazy lunatics, what on earth are they up to? Killing the Führer, they must have been out of their minds. And when General Speidel comes to see him, stricken with a guilty conscience, of course, a couple of days later still, Rommel turns angrily to Speidel and says, I now understand what that guy Hofacker was talking about. I now understand what he was getting at. They must have been out of their minds. Well, he says, I'm glad I had nothing at all to do with it. That, however, is not the perception in Hitler's headquarters, because Hofacker is arrested almost immediately after the bomb plot. Somebody blabbed on him. Hofacker is arrested. He's a lieutenant colonel in the German Air Force, and the only way he sees to save his own miserable skin is to play Scheherazade. He starts singing. He starts telling tales on every name he can imagine, and every time they're just about to take him off and hang him, he says, wait, there's a few more people I can mention if you give me a couple more days. So he starts singing. And on July the 31st, 1944, Adolf Hitler sends for General Jodl. Correction, on August the 1st. Adolf Hitler sends for General Jodl, and I've got the diary of General Jodl, who was the chief of the German Armed Forces Operations Staff. 5 p.m., the Fuhrer has read out to me the report that Kaltenbrunner now has, Kaltenbrunner, the chief of the Gestapo, about the testimony of Lieutenant Colonel Hofacker on his talks with K and R. K, Field Marshal Kluger, the new Commander-in-Chief West, who has replaced Rundstedt a few weeks earlier. R is Rommel. The Fuhrer says he's going to look for a new Commander-in-Chief West. He's going to have R questioned after his convalescence, after he gets better, and then he's going to retire him without any further fuss. Interesting. The old friend, Rommel and Hitler didn't want anything unpleasant to happen to Rommel. He was going to question him about his involvement in the plot, the July 20 plot, and then retire him without any further fuss. But things didn't go like that, because Hofacker is talking more. In a further testimony, Hofacker says, when I went to see Rommel, he couldn't be restrained. He says, you can count on me when the time comes, which is totally untrue. Stulpnagel, the military governor of Paris, reports precisely the same. Stulpnagel is fetched by the Gestapo from Paris and taken back to Germany for questioning. As he crosses the German frontier, he shoots himself in the eye, tries to kill himself. He just shoots himself blind, and with sufficient blood transfusions, General Stulpnagel is brought back, a rather pathetic figure, to Germany, where he's subjected to Gestapo interrogation, where he says that he understood that Rommel was on their side, that Rommel was part of the plot. You see, the tendency, ladies and gentlemen, is these people, they know that unless they're going to play their cards very carefully, they're for the high jump. And the only way they can save themselves is to say, well, if you're going to hang me, there's one or two other people who are going to hang too. How about your Field Marshal Kluger? And how about the big one, Field Marshal Rommel too? And this is the awkward one for the Germans, for Hitler, because he can't really hang Rommel. So he picks up everybody else. He picks up Kluger's chief of staff, Blumentritt, who seems to have known of the plot, and then again he doesn't seem to have known of the plot. And then on September the 4th, 1944, he has arch-villain Hans Speidel, Rommel's chief of staff, arrested and picked up by the Gestapo for questioning. Speidel also sings like a canary. And it's very interesting. If I go to the National Archives now, ladies and gentlemen, and say, I want to see the Gestapo interrogations, the famous Kaltenbrunner reports on the people of the 20th of July, they'll give you a whole fistful of the reports of the interrogations of everybody who was unimportant. But the interrogations of Speidel and Heusinger and other generals in Germany who subsequently became top NATO generals are not in the files anymore. They've vanished. They've been sanitized. You can't see them anymore. But I know what Speidel said, because one of the documents that General Kirchheim's widow gave me was a report from General Kirchheim on the Court of Honor that was held by the German army to consider the case of Hans Speidel. You see, in trying to preserve its traditional privileges after the appalling catastrophe of the 20th of July, which was a terrible blot on the name of the German army said, well, at least let us try our own criminals. Before these people are turned over to the People's Court to be tried and hanged, let the German Army Court of Honor try them first to decide whether they are worthy of being put on trial, to see whether there's a case to answer. And the Court of Honor, in the case of General Hans Speidel, met on October the 4th, 1944. I know exactly what happened there, because the 5 German generals who comprised the Army's Court of Honor consisted of General Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, the chief of the Heim Command, General Guderian, the famous German Panzer commander, General Rundstedt, General Kirchheim, and another. Now, Kirchheim was a staff officer who had already rubbed up Rommel the wrong way in the North Africa campaign in 1941. He didn't really like Rommel. And he writes in his own private papers an account of this Court of Honor. He says the prosecution was directed by Kaltenbrunner himself, the chief of the Gestapo. Kaltenbrunner said that Speidel had admitted under testimony that he knew in advance of the plot on Hitler's life. But Hofacker who had come and told him about the plot on Hitler's life, had told him, Speidel, and he, Speidel, had done the proper thing by reporting it to his superior, Field Marshal Rommel. At this, writes Kirchheim in his report, an embarrassed silence fell on the court, and beklommenes Schweigen. An embarrassed silence because we realized that either we were going to have to exonerate Rommel or exonerate Speidel, one or the other. If Speidel was telling the truth, he had done his duty and had reported it to Rommel, and Rommel had told nobody. If Speidel was lying, then Rommel was in the clear. We decided that the correct thing to do was to ask for further inquiries to be made in the case of Speidel. And in that way they saved Speidel's life, effectively, because the matter was then put on ice, on the back burner. But at that moment, the problems for Rommel started. This is quite plain. Rommel's already got problems. He's got a quadruple skull fracture. He's been evacuated back to a hospital in Germany. And he becomes gradually aware of the rumors and the whispers going around that he was supposed to have been involved in the 20th of July. There are Gestapo cars shadowing him. Gestapo officers are stationed at both ends of the country lane outside his house. When he goes walking in the fields with his son Manfred Rommel, who's now the Lord Mayor of Stuttgart, he takes a loaded gun with him. He also takes with him in his inside breast pocket a fistful of papers, copies of telegrams which he sent to the High Command during the Battle of France to show how he pleaded for reinforcements, and how he pleaded for reinforcements even before the invasion of Normandy. Because he thinks that the problem that's building up around his name is not connected with the 20th of July, because he knows he's in the clear, he knew nothing about it. But he thinks he's going to be made the fall guy, the scapegoat for the collapse in France. So just in case he is arrested here in midfield, walking with his son, he wants to have the papers in his pocket so that he can defend himself at the court-martial when the time comes. The dossier, the Normandy dossier, he carries it with him at all times, so he tells Manfred. On October the 1st, when he finds out that Speidel, his chief of staff, is being picked up, a Swabian like himself, a close friend of his, he's a close friend of Speidel and his family, he sits down and he writes a letter to his Führer, Adolf Hitler. Rommel does. And I found this letter among the private papers of Helmut Lang, his ordnance. And I'll read out one or two paragraphs. Because, again, it shows that Rommel was totally in the dark about the 20th of July, and that he was an upright, decent man who, even at this moment, did what he could to protect Speidel, regardless of what was happening, regardless of what Speidel was saying about him, and regardless of what Speidel would eventually do to kill him. Mein Führer, wrote Rommel on the 1st of October 1944. I had to translate it from the German as I go along. Unfortunately, my state of health is not good enough as I would have wished. The quadruple skull fracture, the rather unfavorable development of things in the West and since my injury, and not least the dismissal and arrest of my previous Chief of Staff, Lieutenant General Speidel, which I only learned by chance, have really taxed my nerves far beyond what I can bear. I just don't feel capable of putting up with any kind of fresh burden. General Speidel was attached to me in the middle of April 1944 as the successor of Lieutenant General Gauser as my Chief of Staff. He was warmly recommended by Colonel General Seitzler and his previous Army Commander, Infantry General Wöhler. Shortly before he arrived at Army Group B, he received from you personally the Knight's Cross, and he was promoted to Lieutenant General. In the West, Speidel, in the very first weeks, showed himself to be a remarkably capable and energetic Chief of General Staff. He ran a tight ship, he had much understanding for the troops, and he really helped me to get the Atlantic War ready for the invasion battle. When I went off to the front, which was almost every day, I could rely on the fact that General Speidel, behind my back, was carrying out the orders that I discussed with him and issuing them to the armies, and he was carrying out conferences with all the other areas and headquarters exactly as I would have wanted. Then he goes on, unfortunately, the defence battle in Normandy, because that's what he's worried about, the fact that he's going to be made the scapegoat. Unfortunately, the defensive battle in Normandy has turned out not to be, we couldn't run it the way we wanted, so that we couldn't defeat the enemy while he was still on the water, or even on the beaches. I've set out the reasons why in the various documents that I sent to you, and which General Schmundt probably showed to you at the time. In the final paragraph, he says, I really can't understand what has been the reasons. No, here he says, up to the day of my injury, July the 17th, Speidel was always at my side, and Field Marshal Kluge, Commander-in-Chief West, also seems to have been very satisfied with him. I frankly cannot understand what has led to the dismissal of Speidel and to his arrest. His final paragraph is, "You, my Führer, know how I have always done everything in my power and ability, whether in the Western campaign, the French campaign in 1940, or in Africa in 1941 to 1943, or in Italy in 1943, or again here in the West in 1944. I've done everything I could. I've had only one thought in uppermost in my mind, always at all times, to fight and to win victories for your new Germany." The last letter that we have from Rommel to Hitler, I quoted it in full in my book. It's a very interesting letter. A few days later, Rommel is told that he's got to turn up in Berlin for questioning. He doesn't understand what's going on. He's still seriously ill. He can't sleep for months because of the skull damage. He sends a message back to the Army Personnel Office saying, "I can't come to Berlin. My health isn't good enough to travel." Finally, on October the 13th, Hitler sends for Field Marshal Keitel, the chief of the German High Command, and he dictates a letter to him from Keitel to Rommel, which runs as follows. "Field Marshal Rommel, you will see from the enclosed testimonies of General Speidel, General Stulpnagel, and Lieutenant Colonel Hofacker that you have been incriminated in the attempt on my life, or on the attempt on the Führer's life. You alone can know whether this is genuine or not, whether there's any truth in these allegations or not. If you consider you are innocent, it is open to you to come to Berlin and answer eventually to the People's Court. If you know that you cannot put up a defense, then you, as a German officer, know what is the best thing for you to do." It's a very clear hint of what he's got to do. Keitel sends for 2 German Army personnel officers, General Burgdorf and General Meisel, the head of the personnel office and his deputy, and says, "Carry this letter down to Rommel and show it to him and tell him what he's got to do." October the 14th, the 2 German generals turn up at lunchtime. Rommel knows they're coming because he's received a phone call in advance. He knows he's going to get a visit from the German Army personnel office. Optimistically, as he sometimes is, he thinks they may be going to discuss with him a new army group command, perhaps in the Kurland or fighting on the Eastern Front. But the pessimist in him says it might just be bad news. It might be that they're going now to call me in for questioning over the collapse in France. Oldinger, that's his adjutant, he says, "Oldinger, have that Normandy dossier ready. I may need it." And he waits for the arrival of the 2 generals at lunchtime. When they turn up in a very small, modest car, Rommel doesn't know it, but the funeral wreath has already arrived that morning at the local railroad station. He doesn't know it, but for 20 miles around, every autobahn has been sealed off to prevent his escape. The 2 German generals come in. He invites them for lunch, and they say, "No, we can't stay for lunch. This is business." Rommel is rather shocked. He invites them into the smoking room, and he says, "How can I help the gentleman?" And by way of answer, General Burgdorf hands to him the letter which says, "Field Marshal Rommel, you've been accused in the testimony of Speidel, Hofacker, and Stulpnagel of complicity in the plot on the Führer's life. If you are innocent, come to Berlin, answer the People's Court. If you know that you cannot answer these allegations, then you as an officer know what you have to do." What can Rommel do at this time? What are the thoughts that go through his tortured brain, his sleep-racked, fractured skull, his tortured, painful brain? He can only think to himself, this is the end. I can't really go to Berlin and say I knew nothing about the Führer's plot. I knew nothing about the attempt on his life. I knew nothing about this treachery. All I was planning to do and discussing with my colleagues and my staff was possibly opening up the Western Front and making common cause with Montgomery and Eisenhower and marching against the Russians. I can't do that. If I do that, I'm a dead man anyway. My life is over. But if I admit that I knew about the plot, then I can save General Speidel's life. My good old friend Speidel. It's ironic, isn't it? So Rommel, in that moment, takes a decision which is a decision I really have to admire that man for. It's the most upright and honest decision that any German general has taken, certainly in World War II. He turns to General Burgdorf and he says, "Jawohl, ich habe mich vergessen." Yes, I must have forgotten myself. It's all true. But he then goes on to say, and Burgdorf then says, well, if you now do as an officer would have to do under the circumstances, the Führer makes the following guarantee to you. You will be given a state funeral as a great hero. The German public and the world will be told that you have died of your injuries received in the strafing attack in July. Even your wife will not be told the truth. Nobody will ever find out. You have the Führer's word for that. And in fact, Hitler kept his word, as subsequently turned out. Rommel says, but I can't shoot myself. And Burger says, oh, no, you mustn't shoot yourself. We can have no damage to your skull. Nothing that will show. He says, we have brought a substance with us that works in 20 seconds. Rommel says, can I take leave of my wife and son? And they grant him that request, and he goes up to see his wife, Lucy, who's lying upstairs in bed. And he says to Lucy, we know this because Lucy wrote a graphic account of it, an affidavit subsequently, when she was trying to establish what actually happened. Rommel said to Lucy, it's extraordinary. Speidel, Stulpnagel and Hofacker have said that I was involved in the plot of the 20th of July. They said that if it hadn't been for my head injury, I would now be put in command. I have no possible salvation. So in 20 minutes I will be dead. Manfred, his son at that time, 15 years old, comes into the room, bustling in and rather puzzled by the extraordinary atmosphere that he finds between mother and father. And the father says the same to Manfred. Manfred and Rommel, the field marshal, leave the bedroom together and go downstairs, and Rommel puts on his great leather top coat and walks out into the garden, followed by General Burgdorf and General Meisel. Manfred still can't understand what's happening. Rommel, putting on his coat, he finds he's got the house keys in his pocket and the wallet. He takes his wallet out and he gives it to his son, and he takes the house keys and gives these to his son as well, and he says, I don't need these anymore. He climbs into the back seat of this little car, and the two other generals pile in beside him, and there's no room for Rommel, and they shut the doors, and Rommel winds down no room for Manfred, so he stays outside, and Rommel, the field marshal, sitting inside, winds down the window, and he says to Manfred, Manfred, look after Frau Speidel. I don't think I've managed to save her husband. And the car drives off down the lane. It drives off down the lane a couple of 100 yards. We know this because I have the eyewitness account written immediately afterwards by the SS corporal who was driving the car from the Führer's motor pool in Berlin, a corporal called Heinrich Doser. Heinrich Doser said, we drove down the road a couple of 100 yards, and then Burgdorf tapped me on the shoulder and told me to stop the car and get out. And then he told me to go for a walk for 5 minutes. When I came back, writes Doser, I found Field Marshal Rommel slumped over on the back seat of the car. He wasn't groaning. He was sobbing. Schluchzend. I sat him upright, but his hat had fallen off, so I put his hat back on again. And thus died Field Marshal Rommel. He died a hero really to the last moment of his life. He had fought his battles cleanly. He had always preferred to fight with tactics in a way that saved lives on both sides. He didn't like to see soldiers being killed. He told his own troops to dig in. He tried to outwit and trick the enemy into surrender. And he died in a way that saved the life of his close friend General Speidel, although by that time he probably knew that he had precisely that man to thank for the fact that he had been handed the Socratic dish of poison to swallow.